Hello and welcome to More Tools and Sense. This is the show where I show you how to take rusted old garbage that doesn't run and turn it into rusted old garbage that kind of runs. Now today we're going to be saving thousands of dollars on an engine rebuild simply by doing all the machine work at home in your garage with no experience and your fingers crossed the whole time. Okay, well now that all the machining and cleaning is done, it's time to get to the fun stuff. We're going to put this engine back together. I do have a few more pieces to put together. I have to push the wrist pins into the pistons and double check some of the specs, but then after that we're going to slam this engine together and hopefully it's going to run. So before I start assembling the engine, I want to double check that everything's within tolerance. And one of the things I want to make sure is that the crank bearings have the correct tolerances for the journals. They need to have spacing between the bearings. And to check that, I'm going to use a plastic gauge. Basically, you put a little tiny piece of plastic in there, and then you torque down the bearing caps and make sure that when the plastic compresses, it compresses to the right size. If it doesn't get compressed enough, that means you have too much space between the bearings, and if it gets compressed too much, that means they're too tight. So we're going to check that out and make sure everything's within spec. Alright, well the tolerances are a little looser than I'd like. They're all at about 3/1000 of an inch, and they should be closer to 2, but I guess we're going to send it anyway. We'll see how it goes. Alright, well the next step is to set the ring gaps. Now, what you're going to do for this is place the ring into the cylinder that it's going to be in, and then use a piston, or if you have a special tool, you want to make sure that it's nice and square, so that it's in the right place. Then you can use a feeler gauge and figure out what the gap is. Once you've measured the gap, you'll know if you need to remove anything. It's always better to have your gap a tiny bit too big versus too tight, because if it's too big, then you might have a tiny bit of blow-by. If it's too tight, you might break all your pistons. So usually a little bit safer to go err on the side of a little bit too big. Now when you're cutting these, you want to make sure that they're nice and square, meaning the lines are parallel when they're inside the bore. So I started off doing this with a file, which did a nice job of removing the material, but because the file was wider than the gap, it would end up taking them out of square when you would put them back in. So now I've switched over to using a Dremel tool with a very thin, fine blade, turned down as low as I can get it. It still removes the material a little faster than I would like, but when you're done, it will cut them even because it's about the same thickness as the ring gap itself. Well, now that I've finished assembling all the parts, getting them together, cleaning, checking, and making sure everything's ready to go, now we get on to the easy part, which is assembling the engine. All you have to do for that is cut to a montage.
tip, just because there's a hole doesn't mean you need to plug it, particularly the ones that feed the water pump. No freeze plugs for them.
Now, why am I putting the oil in this engine so early? Well, because I want to check the oil pump and make sure everything is getting oil where it's supposed to. For that, I'm going to need to prime the pump, and for that we need a special tool. Now, all I did was take a hex head off of a box wrench and just chop the end off and weld it onto this piece of steel. We can then drop it all the way down inside the engine, and it will mesh with the oil pump. Now we can hook a drill up to it, prime the pump, and make sure that the oil is actually getting to all the places it's supposed to. Well, I've gone as far as I can with the engine right now, so I'm going to turn my attention to the transmission. Well, the chassis I bought, it did come with a transmission, but it's a slush box, and the guy wasn't even sure it would work anyway. So since I'm not about that perndle, Patches and I are going to go to the happiest place on earth. Crazy Rays! Well, this is a Dodge Dakota, and I'll be removing the NV3500. This is a pretty solid transmission and should be more than capable for our very mild V8. First, we're going to clean it up, then I can install the clutch and get it ready to go onto the engine.
And now for something completely different. Completely different.
Alright, well I'm getting ready to mate the engine and transmission together and we got a problem. The flywheel and the clutch are different sizes. They don't work. I ordered the flywheel to fit the engine, I ordered the clutch to fit the transmission, and they don't mate up. So first thing I need to do now is I need to put the transmission on the engine so I can see if the starter will actually fit on this flywheel and work correctly, and if it does, then I need to order the smaller clutch to fit this flywheel. If the starter doesn't fit, then I need to get a new flywheel that does work, which will hopefully be the same as the clutch I already have. Well, if the starter worked, I could show you how it doesn't work. But there's about ½ an inch of space in between the flywheel and the drive gear on the starter, so it looks like I'm going to need to order a new flywheel.
And now for something completely different. different.
Alright, well now that I have the correct flywheel to go with the clutch that I have, and hopefully fit to the starter, the bell housing, and everything's going to work together, fingers crossed, let's get this engine and transmission slammed together, throw it in the frame. Alright, so ran into a little bit of trouble. I couldn't get this pilot bearing to fit. It was just a little bit too big to go inside of the hole here, but that's because that's not where it goes. It's a larger bushing that's supposed to go in this larger section of the crank. And after a little bit of internet research, I found that exact part, and better than that, specifications. So instead of ordering said part, I'll just make one on the lathe, and we'll be back in business. Well, as you can see, the part I needed was pretty simple. So why wait 4 days for something to arrive when you can just make it in 4 hours from scratch? Alright, well this was the transmission mount that I thought I was going to use. However, when it is installed underneath the transmission, the engine is perfectly level, which sounds great, except that the rear axle has a pinion angle of about 1.7. And of course the pinion angle needs to match the angle of the engine and drivetrain. So if I drop this down and put some 1/2-inch spacers underneath the old mount that was the original Dodge, and I set that on there, it comes out to almost exactly 1.7. Well, now that the engine is inside the frame, it's time to put the body and the frame back together. But in order to see that, you're going to have to tune into the next episode, so hit that subscribe button and you won't miss it.
Smooth it all around the place so that everything is stuck to it. I'll put that one in, okay? I'll put it in.
Go ahead.